so much for joining us, Dr. Jorge Duany. As we seek to understand better the unprecedented wave of migration that has been gripping the United States, especially from Central America and Cuba. As most of us know, about 200,000 Cubans have arrived in the United States through the Mexican border and other means, most of them coming to Florida since about last fall. This number is really higher in the shortest period of time that we've seen since the very early period of the revolution when Fidel Castro adopted communism in Cuba in the 1960s. But even then, I don't think there was a year in which we had 200,000 people arriving. So I wonder if you can explain how these Cubans are arriving in the United States and how you think Biden's recent changes to immigration policy might affect those arrivals.
Yeah, so the current wave, I think, can be traced back to 2017, January of 2017, when President Obama canceled the so-called wet foot, right foot policy, which had been in place since 1994 and 95, allowing Cubans who made it to U.S. soil to stay here while deporting those who were caught at sea. That policy ended in 2017, and then practically no Cubans would be allowed to enter the United States legally. And also those who were coming in without authorization decreased by a large margin because they were sent back to Cuba. And then in 2020, the Cuban economy plunged by about 11%, which is the worst economic performance since the so-called special period in the early 1990s. This is the so-called second special period that Carmelo Mesa Lago talks about in his work. And since then, the economy has not recovered. Add to that, of course, the a pandemic, which made life miserable for Cubans as well as for other people around the world. And I would also add the protest that took place on July 11 of 2021, as well as the crackdown by the Cuban government on people who had participated in peaceful demonstrations on that day. So all of this is a perfect storm, I think, that explains the sudden and dramatic and continuing rise of Cubans trying to leave their country to the more or less the number of 225,000 in the last fiscal year, and increasing in the last couple of months of last year, and even now as we speak. The main way in which Cubans are now coming is through the land border with Mexico. They first usually fly to Nicaragua, which doesn't require visas for Cubans, and then somehow make the long journey to the border, to the U.S.-Mexico border. But we've also seen an increase in the number of rafters. More than a few years ago. Last year, about 6,000 people were detained by the U.S. Coast Guard, and this year, beginning in October, has also registered a climb. So whichever way you measure it, the Cuban exodus at this point is the largest ever recorded in a single year. Even before the revolution or after the revolution, there has never been such a large number of Cubans trying to reach the United States by any means possible.
So how is it that Biden's change in policy might affect these arrivals? Do you think it's going to deter people from coming, or do you think they're going to take to the sea?
One possible result is precisely that Cubans will continue to come by sea rather than through the land border because they know they will be deported if they're caught. Another one, I think, another possibility is that it will take some time, perhaps a few months, if not years, for Cubans to realize that the land border is in effect close to them. And of course, a third alternative, which is probably the most desirable one, is that the U.S. Embassy in Havana has begun to issue immigration visas for about 20,000 per year, as has been the case in the past before 2017. So my hope would be that Cubans will come to the United States more and more through legal channels rather than through these very complicated and dangerous ways through land and sea.
I think that there are two big factors or facts, perhaps, that have not been in the press at all that really have great bearing on the conversation about Cuban refugees and their experience in trying to leave the island. And one of them is the price that they are paying. I understand from my own family that it's costing anywhere from $14,000 to $28,000 per person. This is US dollars per person to get out through human trafficking means. And secondly, that part of that cost is the extraordinary price that an airline ticket now consumes from Havana to Managua, for instance, or Havana to another point in Central America. The other factor that nobody seems to be talking about is that narco traffickers are the ones who have shifted operations from their regular drug trafficking to human trafficking because it's so lucrative. So I wonder if you could address that. Like, why are the airline tickets so expensive? And secondly, how are Cubans experiencing, the process of having to depend and rely on people who, are armed and who have a history of working in narco trade?
Right. Those are two topics that are not frequently discussed in the media today, but they are very important. The first one, of course, is that the price of subsidizing migration to the U.S., whether it's legal or illegal, is extremely high. It's beyond the reach of most ordinary Cuban citizens. So therefore, the question is, where do they get the money from? And I think the main answer is from their relatives in the United States, who typically send them money so that they can pay for whatever expenses, the travel expenses and the expense of crossing borders through Central America and eventually reaching Miami, which is their ultimate destination for most of them. So that's probably the response to that. In addition, we've also heard reports that some Cubans, especially those who have been able to save some money and can sell other properties in Cuba or work on their own in the cuenta propista sector, the self-employment sector. But again, that seems to be beyond the reach of most Cubans. So I think the main explanation is the financial support by close relatives here in Miami. And the other part of your question is why are the prices so high? First of all, because until the Nicaraguan government allowed Cubans to enter without visas, there were few flights, commercial flights between Havana and Managua. And then when this sudden group of people started to fly to Nicaragua, and of course there are jokes that supposedly Cubans want to see the volcanoes in Nicaragua, but they end up in Hialeah rather than in that country, because they really use it mostly not as a destination point, but as a transit point. So I think it's a question of supply and demand. There are so many more Cubans who are trying to leave their country desperately than the commercial or the charter flights can provide an avenue for. That again, it's almost impossible for a regular Cuban to finance that trip.
Have you heard that, and this may be true or false, but have you heard that there is a kind of racket by which Cubans in Miami are buying up all the tickets for these flights and then reselling them, and that's the means by which they are making money, and also is one of the factors that explains the fact that the ticket prices are so high. I mean, the posted price may be over $1,000, but I know of people who are paying up to $5,000 or $6,000 just for the airline ticket.
I don't myself have any data to answer that question about how exactly the tickets are priced and sold, but it wouldn't surprise me to find out that many of the travel agents and the individual Cuban Americans who are based here in Miami may be using this as a way to make money. Because of course we know that many of the charter flights, many of the package companies, the remittance and recharging of batteries for phones have become very lucrative businesses here in Miami for Cuban American enterprises.
Mm-hmm. I would just also add that there are lots of people who are selling their houses, as you say, in Cuba. One of the impacts of that is that those who have a good house to sell often are those who participate in the non-state sector, as you say, as entrepreneurs, and are slightly wealthier or a lot wealthier than their neighbors. And one of the effects has been, at least I have heard anecdotally from both a visiting relative and then students who have gone to Cuba, is that you have whole neighborhoods or sometimes whole towns where there used to be maybe 10 guys who were licensed to be plumbers or to be taxi drivers, and now you're left with one. The other result is that you have lots of houses that are being bought up by individuals who are perhaps politically connected and part of the 10% of Cuba's population that is rich because of their political connections. as well as Cubans who had left several years ago, might have gone to Spain and now have bought a house in Cuba and have recrafted it, restored it with their money. And so I just find this to be fascinating because it seems to point towards the consolidation of new forms of bourgeoisie, also to the consolidation of a smaller non-state sector. And then I think that it's important to know that this is the first time in the history of the revolution when people have left the country and have not had their homes confiscated by the state, which would generally in the past have turned around through the committees for the defense of the revolution and distributed those homes to loyalists, and so this is the first time that the state isn't doing that, and people are selling their houses for the purposes, in fact, of getting that money. I wonder what you think about that. I mean, what do you think the impact of that, if it at all is true, might be on the future of Cuba?
Yeah, I think these changes began to take place at least officially about a decade ago, in 2013, if I remember correctly, when the Cuban government announced a series of reforms for travel and migration. And the most important one, I think, after 10 years of observing the results, has been precisely that it now allows Cubans to move or to travel beyond Cuba without losing their rights as Cuban citizens. And it typically requires more than 2 years for that to happen. So in the first 2 years, Cubans can travel, can live abroad, and as long as they return and of course pay for the duties as Cuban citizens, they can retain property, retain their rights, medical health, etc. on the island. So that has created a different kind of migration. In short, it can be called a circular migration because some people do go back and forth, and to the extent that they have family, properties, houses, etc., they can still live in Cuba rather well if they have access to dollars or to euros. And at the same time, they have, again, assets on the island that they can use in order to finance another migration journey like the ones that we're talking about. Also, I want to add that one of the issues that we have seen in the last couple of years is that the demographic impact of this large-scale migration is taking its toll. Cuba is not growing as a population. In fact, it's decreasing in size. And the aging of the population is particularly troublesome, particularly because we know that most of those who leave are younger people or skilled people, like you mentioned in your last question. And so this is having a tremendous impact, not just on the housing market, but also the labor market and the society at large. The problem is that the Cuban society doesn't seem to be prepared to face the consequences of all these demographic changes that it's going through.